This is going to be a very contentious statement.
Laura Lake Adebisi, actor, writer, and director.
Her central roles in theatre have received wide praise. She was the lead in the 5-star production Brief Encounter.
That's a real belief that I had. Don't let them see you cry. Don't let them see you cry.
Having featured in Eastenders and Holby City, she's also the writer behind the critically acclaimed While We Wait. Now, Laura shares her own journey and powerful perspective as a mixed-race voice.
I was different. My hair was different. My skin was lighter. And that made me stand out.
It's not the fully correct story because we also come with our insecurities and pain. What was your pain?
My uncle, Jay Abaton, he was killed by 4 white men outside a club in Brighton in 1999. And I would say that is when the realization of the struggle kind of came really close.
You coming from the space of where you're working in this speaks volumes to what I think is really important about these type of conversations.
I suffered from really bad homesickness. And it was literally like coming home through a book. So many of us had such similar experiences of pain, and even Meghan Markle spoke about it a little bit, and that faced so much backlash from both sides.
Do you see a bright future ahead for, just the idea of a Nigerian identity?
When I grew up in Nigeria, I was called Oyinbo. I still am. That's the term for white people, for white person. At the time, I was very much trying to forge this mixed identity that's different and separate from, but also inclusive of, the different things that make you mixed. Again, it's a very contentious idea, but we need to think of a different way to discuss race. And I think it needs to be...
Laura is one of the most passionate people that I've not only had as a guest, but that I have ever spoken to. She's an exceptional writer and actor, and someone that I now regard as a friend. Laura grew up as a mixed-race girl in Nigeria before moving to the UK, and it's some of her stories and vivid memories that epitomize some of the key messages that this show is about. Have you ever wondered about the pivotal moments in either you or your family's experiences that have had a profound impact on what you stand for? That there is something that you can do that can make for a positive or more inclusive world around you? This conversation can be the inspiration that you need that may just help to refine that answer. In this eye-opening episode, Laura opens up about some of the stereotypes and misconceptions that she's encountered, challenging the notion of the privilege of skin color. With unwavering honesty, Laura sheds light on some of the misconceptions surrounding the mixed-race community. As Laura phrases it, we need to find another way to discuss the idea of race. Through her acting career, Laura has found a powerful platform to amplify her voice and raise awareness around racial bias. We explore her passion around using acting as a catalyst for change. And throughout this episode, you'll begin to understand her dedication for breaking down barriers and challenging some of the issues around identity and race. We are all defined in some way by the people that we meet and the things that we decide to read and listen to. And I really believe that there is a lot that you'll take away from this episode. Enjoy. Laura, so I've read a bit into your early life, and the thing that I found fascinating is connecting some of the really stark and vivid experiences that you went through in your youth to some of the values that you hold strongly, or at least have held strongly, because I'm sure they've changed.
Yeah.
And so for me, you epitomize why this podcast came to be. Because on the one hand, the show does a great job at bringing out some of the recent moments in history that have affected our generation and the lives that we lead. And figuring out the cultural intersections and how they've impacted why we are the way we are is fascinating. But personally for me, the reason why this is so interesting is to see how your multi-generational journey has ultimately resulted in why you stand for what you do and why you've ultimately become what you have. So where should this story start? What is, the pertinent moments in your backstory that have ultimately led you to become the person you are in front of me?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think it actually starts about 3 generations ago with the first of the Adebisi line. So my great grandfather was he changed his name to Adebisi. So he was the first kind of Adebisi that then went on, and we don't really know much about his early life. All we know is that he kind of turned up in Ibadan, which is my hometown in Nigeria, in the early 1900s. He was a thriving cocoa farmer, and he just became really wealthy, but was extremely generous with his wealth, extremely generous. So when the colonial masters started issuing tax on the people of Idikon, which was his little village, he actually ended up paying the tax for the entire town of Ibadan and paid for everyone. And he would, the famous story is that a few days before he died, he invited all of his debtors, everyone who owed him money, to this mansion that he'd built. So he was the first person in Ibadan to have a house built by European people. So he had it built and everything. And all of my second, third cousins still live in that house in Idikon. And so he wrote off all of his debtors. So from him comes my grandfather. And he comes to England to study law. Okay. And meets my grandmother, who had come from Portugal after losing her fiancé. She was a famous fado singer in Portugal. Her famous song is Toma lá Beijinho. And after he died, she never sung again. Wow. And she came to England and they met. And that's my dad's grandparents.
Just on that. So
yeah,
we're going back quite a while, where touching on my very brief understanding of the history of Nigeria, a lot of what we, and I mean that by what we kind of learn in our day and age about the history of Nigeria, revolved around the slave trade.
Oh yeah.
Right. And then, but it seems like your grandfather had a bit more of a, would you say it was more of a unique story?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's quite frustrating that, when I was in school here, every Black History Month was about slavery. You don't learn about the civil rights movement till A-level history. Well, when I was doing it till A-level history. So every Black History Month was about slavery. You didn't learn about anything else. I didn't learn about Windrush until I went to university. Yeah. And that's so crazy because that's actually how both of my grandfathers came over. They were part of when Britain opened up their borders to all the Commonwealth. That is how both of my grandfathers came from Nigeria, came here and met my grandmothers. And I had no idea. And again, Windrush is also framed through a very kind of Caribbean narrative, viewpoint and narrative, but also it was open to Africans as well. And that's how both my Nigerian grandfathers came over. So on my mom's side, my grandfather came over as well. He met my grandmother, Susan, and she was, shunned by her family for choosing to marry a Black African man and have a baby. And they lived, I think, in a bedsit in Brixton or something like that. And eventually everyone ended up moving back. So my grandfather and my grandmother on my mom's side, they moved back to Nigeria quite soon after they had their second child, and they had my mom out in Nigeria. Was
the plan to go and study and then bring that knowledge back? Was that always part of the...
I don't know, but it's what they both did end up doing. So on my dad's side, when my dad was 13, they all moved back, and then his dad practiced law in Nigeria. So my mom and dad then met in Nigeria when they were 16 and 19. My mom didn't actually know that my dad was 16. he like told her 3 months after they'd got, because she just assumed he was older. But yeah, and 38 years later, they're still together and they've got 4 kids. I'm number 3. So that's kind of how the family tree has worked, and that's how I'm here, I would say.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I'm gonna touch on one of the most exciting pieces of research that I've done for a guest before they've come on. Right, it was the interview that you gave for a weekly series called Mixed Up, and in that, one of the things that you say is, my dad is half Nigerian, half Portuguese, and my mum is half English, half Nigerian. But they are so much more than half of anything. Yeah. What did you mean by that?
I think it comes from that word half-caste, right? Or, half-breed or whatever. Like the different things that mixed race people have been called through mulatto. Ugh. Like so many, I'm reclaiming that word as well, by the way, and rechanging. But there's so many different words that we've been called, and the most popular. Honestly, when I was in Nigeria growing up, I called myself half-caste. I didn't know it was a bad thing to say. It wasn't until I came here for boarding school and they were like, "Oh, where are you from?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm half-caste." They were like, "Oh my God, Laura, you can't say that." And I was like, I didn't know that. I didn't understand what I was saying, because Nigeria, I always say, is about 100 years behind. If you think we got our independence maybe like 200 to 300 years after America got their independence, I'd say like Nigeria is just in ideology and stuff, just a little bit behind with stuff, but then ahead in loads of other things. So it's complicated. But with that, it was like, I remember the first time I went to Nigeria and someone said, "Oh, are you mixed?" And I was like, yes, I am. I'm not I'm mixed. And that was a big moment for me. But what I meant by that is that oftentimes, like, we focus on these, with mixed identities, you focus on these fractions, right? I'm half Nigerian, quarter English, quarter Portuguese. But it's like, actually, I'm a whole person, and these different things have come together to make me who I am, but they are not. My parents are not half Nigerian. My parents are Nigerian. My mom is not half English. My mom is English. My dad is like, they're not half of anything. They are just these two things existing together in one. I am these 3 things existing together in one. And it's just like, I think we focus so much on those fractions and on those halves. And I mean, I've got 2 little nephews, and my sister-in-law is like, she's got Indian, Zambian, Scottish heritage, and then my brother. And it's like, if I try to do the math to figure out the fractions that my nephews are, my mind will explode. And it's like, well, that's because this thing doesn't work. Saying I'm half this and half, you're not. You are those things, right? And I think with mixed identities, we often get pushed into saying we're one thing or another. And I think what I'm learning through a whole lot of therapy is that multiple things, multiple feelings and emotions and multiple realities can exist at one time.
Let's go back to your earlier parts of your childhood. Your story reminds me a lot of Trevor Noah and his book called Born a Crime, literally because he was born a crime. Fascinating, because it gives such a good and also humorous, given Trevor's style, but also very, very deeply emotional and emotive take on what it's like to be this term called mixed race. And he says a lot of things in the book that sound very similar to what you have said. And you mentioned it in that interview that you gave, where you said that, a lot of people can characterize you guys by thinking that you are, blessed, or as you say, peng, because you have this great mix of things. But in that, you also mentioned that it's not the fully correct story, because we also come with our insecurities and pain. What was your pain?
So in Nigeria, I went to my grandmother started a school in Nigeria that my mum ended up running. So I went to a school in Nigeria. I was born here, but kind of went back to Nigeria like a few weeks after I was born. And I grew up there from born till about 5, came here for 2 years, went back 7 to 13. It was, this is going to be a very contentious statement, but I actually experienced a lot of racism for not being fully black, for being mixed race. Now, I think there's a difference between racism and institutionalized racism. So I do believe that anyone can be racist. The racism didn't necessarily affect my ability to advance socially, politically, economically. But it very much affected me emotionally. And I was different. My hair was different. My skin was lighter. And that made me stand out. And to kids, and then my mom running the school as well, to kids, it kind of puts a bit of a target on your back. And I think you try and maintain this air of like, oh, it doesn't bother me. I'm going to be strong. I can't let them see me cry. That's a real belief that I had. Don't let them see you cry. Don't let them see you cry. But I was a very emotional and sensitive kid. And there was a lot of times where I was kind of made to feel sad and left out and different. And what I will say is that racism feels the same wherever it's coming from. There were moments, I think, as an adult where I was able to see the positives and the privileges that were afforded to me with that. But it was still that feeling of being different, of being treated differently, and of being, abused for being lighter. There was also a massive sexualization of the mixed race identity from a very young age. I remember I was 12 and I was kind of cornered by a group of girls in my school. There must have been about 10 of them. And I was literally, my back was up against the wall and they were all around me and I was chewing gum. And one of the girls said to me, "Why are you chewing gum like a prostitute?" And I was 12 and I didn't understand that, because at that age, there was a lot of, even from 11, 12, I was very fetishized. The older boys in my school, there was a massive fetishization of, light skin, mixed race. And that in turn created a lot of a lot of anger and frustration from what I would now call my fellow black women, and a lot of that was very much taken out on me. And it felt like it was because of the color of my skin, and it felt racial. It was racial. So that and those experiences was as so weird, but as emotionally scarring and painful to me as me walking down the street and a white drunk man coming up to me and saying, "Get out of our country, you fucking black bitch."
Yeah.
They completely different, but they felt the same. I was always made to feel like I wasn't Nigerian. That intensified massively when I went to university as well, that actually I was more Nigerian than a lot of the Nigerians in university that had been born and brought up here and maybe only gone back for holiday a couple times. I grew up there. My family lives there, right? And I was often made to feel like I wasn't black enough and I wasn't Nigerian enough, and my experience of blackness wasn't valid. My experience of racism from both sides, I could only talk about one, right? And it just that stuff was hard. My mom felt it a lot as well. Like my mom, and I obviously carried those stories from my mother with me. My mom was in university college hostels. She was stripped naked and beaten by a group of girls for being mixed race. It was something that was so hated and so kind of, especially by Nigerian women. There was a lot of friction. Now I'm generalizing here, of course, and this was not my experience with all Nigerian women, but I carried those experiences that my mother had with me. So I was always on guard as well, which perhaps maybe even made me a bit more sensitive to things than I would have been. But as I got older, I started to see kind of the positive and privilege side to it. Like there was a day when my dad and I were kind of stuck in traffic, and we needed to get food before I went on the plane. I've got a dairy allergy and I can never eat on planes, basically. Well, back then anyway. So we needed to get food. So we walked to the Sheraton, and we got out of the car and we just walked to the Sheraton. And the man at the gate just kind of let us in and just like assumed that we were staying at the hotel and let us in. And I was wearing like trackies, drab clothes, ready to go on the plane. My dad wasn't dressed particularly nicely either. And they were nice and welcome and let us in. And like, as we went in, I asked my dad, I said, Dad, if we were darker, do you think they would have let us in? And he looked at me and said, probably not. They probably would have given us hell because they would have thought that we didn't like belong in this space or couldn't afford it or whatever. It's very obvious that actually we are seen as being privileged as well. We are associated with having more money because we have lighter skin, which causes hell with police when we're out there. But there are these associations and assumptions that are made about us. You know, for a lot of women, it was that you think you're gorgeous. Is there something wrong with it? But more than that, you're cocky. You think you're arrogant.
You're painted with a character that's just based on
these assumptions. Exactly. Yeah. And that is what I've been fighting. I feel like I've been fighting that. I wouldn't say so much anymore now that I'm back in London and it's more of a multicultural space. But I would say from the age of like 2 till about 23, I definitely felt like it was something that I was physically like constantly fighting, this portrayal of these assumptions that were thrown at me because I was mixed.
This is what makes your story, I think, so fascinating, because everything that you've touched on there, but you also mentioned that your mother also comes from a mixed descendant. And one thing that I remember from Trevor's book, actually, he talks about how pre-1990, before Martin Luther King, even though there was a lot of upheaval happening where black people were trying to fight for the right, it was still very much an apartheid type living, right? Where the men were out working in the mines, so they were rarely home with the family. The women stayed at home, and the men that weren't out working in the mines were probably in jail because they were trying to fight this cause for black power. Yeah. Given that you and your family sat in like a different bracket to that, did your family go through that same kind of experience?
That's why my dad hates this place. Like, my dad does not like this country because believes that he's treated like a lesser citizen here because he's black or mixed, if you want to say he's not, but he is, you know. I think the mixed male experience is very different from the mixed female experience. Okay. Very, very very different. And we have like a little mixed community out in Nigeria as well, which is really nice, and that still kind of exists. And it's this, you know, I'm second generation mixed, so both my parents are mixed, and then we're the second like generation mixed race. And I think there's always been kind of that push and struggle, but I also think my parents have this kind of slight just don't get in trouble. Right? So if I wanted to go to a protest or something, that is something that I don't think they'd really support because they don't want me to be vulnerable, right? But there's been, I was talking to you earlier, my uncle, Jay Abaton, he was killed by 4 white men outside a club in Brighton in 1999. And I would say that is when the realization of the struggle kind of came really close to us. I think fighting that, and that then became really obvious when, you know, those men and the police didn't see my uncle as a half white man. He was a black man. And if you saw the amount of resources, the amount of space, even when he walked into the police room, if you looked at all the other homicide, my mum always says, if you looked at all the other like homicide boards, the massive boards that were dedicated compared to the little tiny space and corner that my uncle occupied, that was what really brought the struggle very into our family, where that is our struggle and that is our fight. And it's part of a bigger fight. It's part of a bigger conversation. Stephen Lawrence, Mark Duggan, it's part of a bigger conversation. But it's very internal with our family. It's very specific.
You know, these things are becoming made very more aware. Like the awareness is becoming put at the forefront, but there's still a lot to be done. Comparing that to your experience when you were in Nigeria, there's something which you're probably familiar with, but the pencil test that the government implemented there, which is where I think if you wanted to work in a public institution, and I guess this did apply a lot more to people who were from a mixed or unclear background where they weren't clearly white or they weren't clearly black. You would go in and then they would take a pencil and they'll run it through your hair. If it fell out, then you'd be classed as white. And if it stayed in your hair, then you'd be classed as black.
In a public?
Yeah, in domain. Or probably even private practices use that as well. But
it's like the bag test in America, where if your skin was lighter than the brown paper bag, then you could go in. If it was darker, you couldn't.
Exactly. So, you know, the fact that it's very clearly labeled that this is the way that they are separating people. So apartheid in itself was a way to separate out the blacks and the whites in different communities. But, you know, even within that, and, you know, like we've touched on, that gets spoken about less is that
coloured community in the middle.
Who were stuck in the middle.
And you know, I would just flag there are a lot of coloured people that don't like being called coloured anymore, but that was the apartheid kind of categorization. I wrote a lot on the coloured community in university, as I mentioned, because again, that focus was black versus white. So what happens to these people that exist in the middle that are disadvantaged as well because of apartheid, not as badly disadvantaged as the black people, but then when affirmative action kicks in post-apartheid, are less favored than black people as well. So what happens to this community? Well, what happens is there's massive amounts of alcoholism, massive poverty, massive rates of rape and domestic violence, sexual assault. All of this stuff exists within those communities, and I think I was so fascinated by the coloured community in South Africa because there was a sense of belonging that existed, because it was an identity that it went all the way back to like the 1700s or 1800s, when like when European people started coming into South Africa and like Indian people, and it kind of all filtered down and they kind of became their own race. And that fascinated me, this idea of not having to say I'm half this and half that, but this is my race, this is who I am, these are my people. That really, I don't know, that was something that at the time I was very much trying to forge this mixed identity that's different and separate from, but also inclusive of the different things that make you mixed. And I found this really amazing group called the Mixed Girl Meetup that's run by my friend like Shakira, which was amazing. And that was like a place where like mixed, women of mixed descent could go, no matter what color you were, white passing, black passing. If you mixed, you were welcome, and you could come in and you could just talk about the experiences. And what was insane is so many of us had such similar experiences of pain and racism from both sides. So many of us had the same story. But then also I then watched a Instagram thing, and it was about a black woman coming forward and saying actually she hates it when mixed people call themselves mixed, because even though that's what they are, she feels like that they're trying not to be black. And that for me was like, oh my goodness. If I'm trying to forge this kind of mixed identity, and does that mean I'm saying to my black sisters that I'm not black, I'm not you?
I know I've touched on Trevor's book a lot, but he talks very specifically about this time he recalls where he almost felt he had to choose which side he was on. And he goes on to say that he chose to be black.
Yeah.
By the idea of, not because that's what most people called him, but purely because of his lived experience. And ultimately that led to what his state of mind felt he was. And he connected, like you said, with his black people.
Yeah.
Do you feel that this lived experience is what really is a driving force of what could influence how a mixed person
self-identifies?
Yes.
Yeah, I think massively. When I grew up in Nigeria, I was called Oyinbo. I still am. That's the term for white people, for white person. I still am. So my identity has been so confused because I grew up there being with amazing parents who taught me to love my skin and love my mixedness. But then I also had the community treating me as though I was white. I then went to boarding school where I had the community treating me like I was black, and where actually we had a really tight-knit community of all of us, like expat kids or whatever, like black kids in this boarding school. And we formed, like, we would go to dinner once a week together and just be the loudest table and have the most fun. And it was like that group, I was part of that group and I was seen as black because we were such a minority in that boarding school. And then I went to Warwick. There were 2 people of color on my course. So it was, I was definitely not white enough to fit in with the kind of like white crowd there. But I also, so I sought refuge in ACS, and that was a space where I really struggled, and I felt a lot of exclusion even in places where I was supposed to be very much included. I felt excluded and I felt pushed out. And I think that made me go, okay, well, I'm not black then. If I've had that experience, then I can't be black. They won't accept me. They don't see me fully as one of them. So race was so central to that. It's not so much anymore. It's become more, it's definitely, I would say, actually, I'm a mixed African woman. It's become more about my African heritage and my Nigerianness than my blackness now. I would say that I'm older and I'm not in that kind of racialized space where I'm like desperate to like, well, where do I fit? Where do I fit? I think, I've said this before, but I think identity is made up of 3 things. I think it's made up of your genotype. So like genetically, where you come from, your phenotype, what you appear as, and then how you self-identify. And your genotype and phenotype hardly ever change. But that third thing when you're mixed is in constant conversation. And the second thing, the phenotype, I hate the word passing, but if you are passing, that is in constant conversation as well. I used to have straight hair and I was treated very differently when I had straight hair compared to when I stopped straightening my hair and went curly, because then I was obviously black as an actor as well. In the industry, it was like, I'm obviously black now. I'm no longer ethnically ambiguous. I'm black, or I have black heritage, whatever. So it changed things a lot. And I think what was really hard as well was this concept of privilege was something I really grappled and struggled with, because I think there are privileges that are afforded to me because I'm mixed race, but I also think there's certain privileges that aren't afforded to me because I'm not dark-skinned, full black woman, right? So this idea of privilege is really touchy, because if someone who's had the luxury of like, yes, on scholarship, but going to boarding school, being educated in the West, having the life that I have had, go to someone who maybe has grown up in a very low income background where, you know, kids mostly drop out of school by 16. A lot of the girls are pregnant by about 12. That was their world. That was their life. And he said, how in the hell can I call those people privileged over me? And the idea of privilege is that it's relative, right? So if someone has the exact same circumstances as you, well, that person will have privilege because they are white and you are not, right? And that's the kind of idea of privilege, is that it's relative, but actually you can't do that. You can't say that, okay, our two exact lives are the same, you have privilege because you're white. It's like, it's so hard to find that sameness where everything's the same. How can I say to like a white person that comes from like a very low income background, has not had the luxuries that I've had of traveling, of seeing the world, and how can I say, oh, you're privileged?
Yeah.
And it's a very contentious idea, but we need to think of a different way to discuss race. And I think it needs to be through this idea of institutionalized racism and systemic racism. I mean, the UK coming out and saying the like English government coming out and saying that, oh, we've done this survey and we found that Britain is not institutionally racist. That is just adding fuel to the fire massively, because that's the conversation we need to be having. It's the systems, it's the, you know, how do we get our spaces to be proportionally representative, or just representative of what the world looks like, or even what England looks like. You know, I did tours around the UK where I went into schools and acting, and I would see the little black girl or the little mixed girl, the little mixed boy in the back, and they'd look at me like, I haven't seen one of you. I haven't seen one of me in ages. And it's like, that is actually the reality in a lot of the UK. So it's just, it's a very kind of complex and complicated idea, and I don't really know what the answer is, but I don't think privilege is the way to go.
You touch on a lot of very important things, but there's two that I want to unravel. So one is this point you make about privilege, and I think the way you pointed out the issue with that title, it got me thinking that there is, and I may get this wrong because it might not be Vice, but I think there was one of those easy to watch, 10-minute things done by Vice where they got a bunch of people who externally were from and internally from very different backgrounds, and they all had to line up and they all gave their definition of what they thought privilege meant as a word. And then there were a list of maybe 20 points where if they were what the sentence said, they took a step forward. If they weren't what the sentence said, then they took a step back, right? And then so the questions got asked, and then at the end you see how many steps forward you've taken, right? The more forward you've gone, the more on an average scale you are privileged than the person behind you. But within that, what was really striking was, well, firstly, people getting to realize, oh, I'm actually more privileged than I realize when you give this broad definition of what it is, because going back to your point, it isn't just about the color of your skin. Yeah. It's not just about that one thing of I come from a mixed background, so obviously I get the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
Like privilege stems across the board. And I think that's part of the message that needs to be had, that you can't hone in on one thing when you see someone and hear just one description or detail about them and ultimately claim that they are of a privileged nature.
And come up with a whole idea of what that means, right? I think we need to be having more honest and open conversations about this. And I think what's actually happening is that there are a lot of white people out there that are really scared to say the wrong thing and to get cancelled, this whole cancel culture thing. But they're and that needed to happen, right? Because there was so much crap that was going on that should not have been going on. So this culture of hypersensitivity, yes, it's needed, and I get it. And I absolutely get it. But at the same time, we need to find space for conversations, not, oh, go read an article and educate yourself. That's not going to work. You learn so much more from having a conversation with someone that you actually care about than not. I have a group of friends from boarding school, and they're all white. And I try to be really open with this stuff with them. So my best friend, she was describing someone one day and she wanted to say that she was a black woman. And she said, "Can I say that?" And I said, "Absolutely, you can. I'm not speaking on behalf of all black people, but to me, you can tell me that she was black. Just tell me something else about her first. Describe something else about the person except for the color of their skin first." And that's what I try and do. I try and surround myself with people who define people by something else that's not their color of their skin first. I think everyone sees color. I hate it when people say I don't see color. Everyone sees color. It's about whether you observe it. Observe it is an active verb, that you are observing it, and therefore you're going to treat someone differently because of the color of their skin. I try and surround myself with people that don't observe color. And so I try and be really open and really have these conversations. But there was a time when I was there and actually the conversation became very uncomfortable. And I had to walk away, and I came back and I had to speak directly to my friend. I would say, "You are making me so uncomfortable right now." I was telling a story of racism that I'd experienced in South Africa. I'd went out there for the first time, and he was combating me and basically saying that it wasn't racism. Now, that would have been fine and okay if this person wasn't someone who would fight the world for me. But in this moment, what was more important to this person was defending these white people that they'd never met before, over just hearing what I had to say about my experience and my story, and my giving me space to share that, being the only person of color in the room. And I had to come back and I had to say that. And I had to say, look, this is not okay. You know, as much as I want to be open and have these conversations, when I'm having these conversations, what you can't do is deny my experiences.
Why do you think they did that?
I think because they are the type of person that says, "I don't see color." So rather than accepting the fact that they probably have a few biases, they're sticking their head in the mud a little bit, and rather than addressing those biases and where they come from. And that's the thing. I think bias is a more interesting way of talking about race than privilege, because we all have our biases. We do. We have them. We walk in the room. We see someone, we see the way they're dressed, we see maybe even their color of their skin, and we will have a bias or an idea about that person based on those things. So it's like, how do we that's what we need to do. We need to actually check our biases, and we need to have really honest conversations about what those biases are.
There's a fascinating series of studies that's been done on how exactly what you're talking about, these biases, the type of impact that they've had in both a school and a work setting. So we're talking about people being impacted by this at all ages, as soon as, you know, they grow beyond a certain age where they realize what's going on in the world. I think, you know, when you're young, you're very creative, free and open to everyone. And then it is, you know, the external environment that shrinks that view. But what this study ultimately is coined under is this idea of stereotype threat, right? Yeah. And what was really interesting that came out of that was that at one point, people who come from a certain stereotype, and it normally comes down to being a minority of some sort, and it can be gender, it can be race, it's normally those two actually, or a combination of both. Yeah. And, you know, the study found that kids from a African-American background, when it was done in the US, when they were graded potentially critically but constructively on a piece of work, when they felt that they were graded that way because they were a minority, i.e. they experienced stereotype threat, then they wouldn't implement the changes that were given, right? So if someone came from a stereotype background, they wouldn't change the content of their essay based on the feedback given, because they felt it was given from a white male or female, and therefore out of a sense of self-esteem, because they felt it was attacking their, you know, internal way of being and not their skill on that paper. And the fact that it's not just at a college level, women scientists or lawyers, there are two examples where it was taken where following a presentation, if there was feedback given that it was felt like came from a body that, again, targeted the fact that, and it's all based on a feeling. It may not have been meant to have been construed in that way, but that's how they've taken it, because they're in an environment where stereotype threat is real, and it causes things like detaching from your own identity or not feeling passionate about the work that you do. And a big one is that it decreases the chance that they're going to recommend someone else from that gender or their background to come and work in that field, because they feel the stereotype threat themselves.
This is the root of everything. It's the emotional pain and the emotional hurt that then causes this like need to put this wall up. It's a cycle of oppression, right? Because you've been oppressed, when actually you're getting a hand up that could, like you said, improve your essay or improve your work or something like that, because you've been oppressed, you don't take that hand because you're scared that hand is going to turn around and slap you. So it's a state of oppression. So you stay sometimes in that state of oppression, and you see it when people don't, when they climb up and they make it out, and their friends might even, there's a level of envy there, but there's also a level of, oh, you sold out, right? You sold out. And we have that a lot in certain Black communities. Oh, you sold out, da, 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 da. But it's like, actually, I think we need to empower ourselves a little bit more. Minority communities need to empower. I do think it's very hard. I'm not trying to take away from how difficult it is, and it can be, but we also need to empower ourselves to take those hands when they come, and to not remain in a state of oppression. We have a choice to an extent. So to whatever extent we have a choice, we need to take those chances and take those leaps. But it is very hard because there is so much systemic oppression. Like in the world, like even in Nigeria, I still see it. It's there. The footprints of colonialism are all over that country. Nigeria should have never been a country. The difference in ideology from the northern side to the southern is just like insane, you know? And then when the eastern side tried to corner off and form Biafra, it was like the ex-colonists were like, no, we don't want that. So they instead empower Nigeria to crush that country. And they're like, no, we want you guys to stay like this so we can continue to pillage and take all of your resources. And it's like the footprints of colonialism are still all over Nigeria. It's in the shape of the country. It's in the map. And it's like, okay, now we're here. How do we fix this? Because there's still such a difference in ideology from the north to the south. There's such bad tribalism. There's such bad religious extremism on both sides, and fanaticism. It's like and poverty. Nigeria is such a rich country in natural resources and stuff like that. And there's so much poverty. There's this beautiful song by Burna Boy called Common Person. Such an amazing song, because when I listen to that song, it reminds me of, there was a time when we were trying to get to Lagos and we had to take the expressway, but the expressway was blocked. There was a fire or something. So we went through back villages and back towns, and I was going through these villages, no electricity, nothing. Women literally carrying water on their heads, this like epitome of kind of rural life. And guess what? So many people were smiling. The children were running around, they were happy and they were smiling. And again, this idea of privilege, right? I'm sitting in that car dealing with really bad anxiety and depression and stuff. And it's like anyone would see me sitting in my air-conditioned car and say that I'm privileged, and I am. But looking at them, I envied their happiness and envied that simplicity in a really weird way as well. I don't know.
I'm really glad that you brought this back up, because earlier I mentioned that there were two things I wanted to touch on. And this leads very nicely onto that second point. So, you know, when you refer to, firstly, the state of poverty in Nigeria, it's insane. There's over 130 million people in Nigeria who are classified as multi-dimensional poor. And multi-dimensional poverty means that you are below a certain income threshold, which I think is, you know, less than $2. But then it's also education and basic infrastructure.
Education is massive.
So the three things combined, and you're talking at over 60% of the Nigeria population are classed as multi-dimensionally poor. But of course, oil is huge there. And the fact that there is a lot of wealth, it's just not trickling down at all, right? It's the people at the top who have put it into accounts in Switzerland so it gathers interest, or they're buying up housing in the UK, probably in the US as well. So given that, there's two things that came to light that I'd heard about that I found really interesting. One was the leaders have no incentive to filter it down because they have no connection to their recent history of Nigeria, because it's always been filled with this idea of conflict from two sides being combined and being given this name Nigeria by colonialism and something that's not to do with them. They don't have a cultural and ethnical attachment to the country because it was forced together, exactly as you say. So given that, and that experience that happened in that generation who are currently the leaders, you did also mention that you are almost proud to be this, you know, Nigerian woman who's based in London, but you are a Nigerian woman. And now we're heading into this culture of people like you from your background, where you are proud to be from that background, but more because of what's coming up now, you know, the contemporary art, the culture, things like what Burna Boy talks about, this idea of there is this new wave of things to be proud about from there. In that sense, do you see a bright future ahead for just the idea of a Nigerian identity? Not talking specifically about the geopolitics of the country, but as the identity of people from this kind of background.
Definitely. I think people are very proud to be Nigerian. There's a massive Nigerian pride. There is a lot of frustration with everything that's happening geopolitically. There is a lot of frustration and a lot of anger. And I think, okay, Nigeria got its independence in 1960.
Yeah.
About 300 years, 200 years later than America. We kind of had our Biafran War, which was kind of like our civil war, okay? So I think because of technology and because of the advancement in ideology, we're running at a faster pace than like America. The reason why I compare to America, because I went to New York and it reminded me so much of Nigeria in such a weird way. The vibe, that hustle, that, oh, today's my day kind of energy, that was like so present in the street. And it honestly, I was there, I was like, this is like a more developed Nigeria. So I do believe that Nigeria is on its way there. And as well, if you go to Abuja and see the capital and what they've done there, oh my goodness, it's so possible. But again, it's this mentality of oppression. The mentality of oppression as a result of colonialism causes you to want to take care of yourself and take care of your own. It pushes you into a state of constant fear and panic that everything around you is going to fall down. And so what that means is you want to have way too much money in your bank account to look after yourself and to look after your family and anyone else that you love and care about. And the amount of care that's given to your fellow Nigerian, nothing else in common with them, is minuscule because we are still in a mental state of oppression to kind of look after yourself and look after your own. And that's not to say, like, there are a lot of business owners that are doing amazing things out there. And what you need to understand, to own a business in Nigeria means to be, if you're going to be a good business owner and a good person, to your employees, you are their NHS, you are their counselor, you are their because the government doesn't provide any of that for them. If someone in their family dies, you're going to decide whether you continue to pay them through that and like do bereavement. And the thing is, like, there's a lot of greed in Nigeria, but you understand where the greed comes from.
Yeah.
I think a lot of these geopolitical issues are going to be solved because I think the youth are going to continue to revolt. But what's really hard is that when the youth did revolt, they shut off the lights and shot them. That's what happened at that toll gate. They turned off the lights and they shot them in the End SARS movement and crippled that movement. And that anger, that frustration, where does it all go? It's still there. It's still there. And that's why I actually have a lot of hope for Nigeria. But it's hard because I'm also a firm believer in not speaking on behalf of the subaltern. That's not me. That's not what I can't. So actually, what needs to happen is those voices need to be given a platform. What did you call them? The multi-dimensionally
poor. Yeah.
The multi-dimensionally poor need a platform for their voices to be heard before any change can really begin to take effect.
You studied English and drama, was it, at university? Some people are led by a trigger in their life that leads them to do what they decided to do. And again, for the last time, I'll refer to Trevor. But why it stood out to me is because I didn't feel that I had that same sort of trigger in my life. But he said that he remembers going out with his grandfather, and this is still at a time when, you know, he is technically an illegal child that shouldn't be out there. But his grandfather brought him out, and he was always, you know, he was kept, I think, in a room until he was 5 because, you know, he wasn't allowed to be out there because if he was out with his mother, there were numerous times where his mother was taken to jail for it. But his grandfather went out and then he called over a police officer. So Trevor's thinking, what? He said, police officer, why is it that you can kiss a horse but not my sister? White police officer, like, so I don't know what you're talking about. And he's like, that's because you haven't seen my sister. And the police officer burst out laughing, right? And then Trevor saw this as like, wow, you know, there's this interaction that's happening between the two races, and the tension has been completely broken down through laughter. And then that was his first source of inspiration of why he went on to really want to do comedy, because he felt that was a way to connect two sides, but then also break down some of the prejudices and educate as he does through a lot of his work. For you, in choosing this career path, did you feel a sense of responsibility that this was a way that you could get out some of these feelings, but also messages that you wanted? Or, you know, was it purely that you could keep your interest, but then your key messages as two separate entities?
When I applied to university, I applied to Cambridge and I missed my grade. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me because my entire personal statement was about post-colonial literature. I chucked like a little paragraph in there about classics as well. The entire Cambridge English syllabus for the first year is all the blimmin' classics. Right. And I hate the classics because they're not representative. Well, back then anyways, might have changed, but that's what it was. Because they're not representative of what my world looked like. When I was 14, 15, the population of Black people in my boarding school started to decline because they raised the school fees. I felt a bit isolated and I started reading a lot. So I found a lot of solace in the library. And I picked up Chimamanda Adichie's Purple Hibiscus. And it was like I suffered from really bad homesickness. And it was literally like coming home through a book. And then I was 16 and I did theatre studies A-level, and we went to the National Student Drama Festival in Scarborough, and there was a production called Nothing. And in it, there's a monologue of a woman, and she tells the story of her best friend, and her best friend gets raped. And she goes on to kind of tell us, they find the man and they send him to jail. And she goes on to tell us what she hopes happens to the man when he's in jail. And she goes into so much detail that you know that everything she's describing is what he did to her friend. Then they took us out, and this guy stands up and says, nothing ever happens to me. After you've heard all of these different stories. And I was crying for 2 hours straight because I finally connected to that pain of sexual assault that so many women go through and endure, something that I would face later on in life as well, and who family members close to me had faced. And I could not stop crying for literally 2 hours after. So those 2 moments were the English and the theatre. If I'd gone to Cambridge, I would have just studied English. When I went to university, I was able to immerse myself in plays from South Africa, Nigeria, books from Nigeria. And that was the route that I took. I read, I learned about partition, and I read stories from Pakistan and from India, and read stories from, Nigeria, Uganda, Sisi Dangaremba, Chinua Achebe, and just like immersed myself in this world. And alongside doing that, started doing acting as well. So started auditioning, getting agents, and I didn't do the traditional drama school because I knew these 2 things, the writing and like theatre, but also entertainment, TV, film, they can have such a massive impact on changing people's hearts. And I think that's the way into changing people's minds, is to change their hearts, is to make them feel something, make them feel sympathy for, the multidimensionally poor, and then maybe they'll do something about it, make them feel something. And that's why Common Person is such a beautiful song, because he captures that spirit so beautifully that it makes you want to do something about it. And so those 2 things for me, I think are, till today, I still think they are the most powerful things that can affect change. And that's what I'm doing, and teaching as well. So luckily I can use my degree, and I'm teaching young kids. And I teach a lot of Black and brown kids because their parents want them to have that. And I clearly see the disadvantage, the way they have been disadvantaged by the school system. And it's like through these things that I would say these 3 things, the writing, the teaching, and then the acting as well, I really feel like massive change can be effected. I did my short film, and that's a story about rape it's a story about 2 siblings, because I love writing about siblings. I've got 3 of them. And it's about how lots of things, including sexual assault, has pulled their relationship apart. But it's also shedding a light on the way rape is handled and treated in Nigeria, and then the effects of it years later, and how it's still kind of... And I wrote this play way before the story started coming out on Twitter from Nigerian women and Nigerian men of their experiences of sexual assault. And it just felt so like it needed to come out, and it needed to be told. And that's what I want to keep doing. I want to continue telling stories that need to be told, and in some way try and give a voice and try and give a platform to the stories that haven't been heard. Stories of mixed experiences as well. Because again, apart from Trevor Noah, no one talks about it. I think even Meghan Markle spoke about it a little bit, and that faced so much backlash from both sides. But it's like, actually, there's a real in-betweenness, and that struggle and that identity, particularly when you are in those kind of pivotal years of 13 to 21, where you're constantly searching for a label and an identity and a place of belonging. Actually, being mixed can be incredibly difficult in those spaces. So how do we fix it? Well, we self-represent. We don't just... We put these kids, they're watching telly, they're watching Netflix, they're watching films. So we put things on there where they can self-identify and self-represent and know that they're not alone. And don't just do it to tick a diversity box. Yeah. If you're going to cast a Black actor in that role, make it count. If you're going to cast a mixed actor in that role. Let's talk about that stuff. Don't just do it to tick a box. That pisses me off. Let's talk about it. Let's dive into the implications of what that means to have a Black person say those words, say those lines, and say that, yeah, I'm very passionate. Sorry.
It's one of the questions I had for you, and I think you've read my mind, because I'd hope it's becoming less and less, but in a lot of spaces there is still this critique around what you'd call this diversity hire, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, it is very much almost a feeling that we need to do this in order to fulfill a tick box exercise. And, you know, I know Hollywood is a prime example to be spotlighted in this, where you'll get critiques either ways, but, you know, one side of it is, you know, there seems to be too much of a push to tick a box rather than do what the underlying purpose is, to make diversity and equality a thing where there is that opportunity for both sides. One of the things it boils down to is that there isn't enough strong representation for that group of people, you know, whether it's Black or colored people. In your experience, is that what you see?
Honestly, yeah. Yeah, it's tick boxing and it's diversity hires. And actually, if you want things to really self-represent and to really dive into the implications of what that means, then you need Black writers. You need Black writers, you need Black directors, you need Black producers. I did something recently, and on set, the song that had been okayed, so there was me and this other Black guy, and we were the only two kind of Black people on set apart from one Black producer. And the song that they get this, I've forgotten the name of the song, but in the song it's I'm a monkey man, I'm a voodoo man, I'm a monkey man. And they're getting this Black actor that I'm acting with to sing this song. And I go to the director and I say, he should not be singing this song. As a person of color, this is wrong. And the director brushes it off that, no, it's just, you know, it's a famous song by these people. It's like, cool. So I went to the Black producer. I said, that song cannot be in this film. It can't be in this film. That's so out of order. Like, they can't have him singing that. And she was like, don't worry, leave it with me. I'll sort it out. The next day I got a call from the director apologizing because and a genuine apology and a genuine, what I did was wrong, right? But I don't know if that song would have ended up in the film if there wasn't a Black producer that I felt comfortable to go and talk to about what had happened. So we need more Black people behind the camera. It's all well and good putting diversity in front of it. That self-represent, I'm not saying it's not nothing, it is important, but the problem with that is also they're choosing a palatable type of diversity, which means mixed. Okay, so they're choosing lighter skinned mixed women, and they're getting privileged and massively, and what we're getting, you know, a lot of privilege and advantages in this industry. That's not to say that we're not missing out on roles because we're not Black enough still. That is still happening also. These two things can exist at the same time, right? But because commercials and stuff want, you know, a nice kind of diversity that's going to go down well with everyone, they're putting mixed people in there or lighter skinned people. And that in turn is creating frustration and anger. And thus the cycle continues and continues. And so it's like, actually, we need to fix this problem from the inside out. And there's some fantastic shows that are doing that. Grey's Anatomy do it brilliantly. And I mean, Shonda Rhimes does it brilliantly. Yeah. Bridgerton is incredible, okay? Because she's taken this question mark in history of was Queen Charlotte Black, said yes to it, and then run with it. But also she hasn't just said, okay, let's do a period piece with Black people in it. Yeah. She's gone, okay, we're going to explain that from the marriage of Queen Charlotte to the king, that actually slavery was ended or this kind of degradation of Black people, and they were upgraded and uplifted into society and I think it's the second or third episode where Lady Danbury speaks to the Duke about it. they address it. It's not, oh, here's diversity for diversity's sake. They've explained it. They've created an alternate version of history where people who look like us exist in these worlds and in these spaces. They've explained it. They've made it make sense. I always say, make it make sense. Whenever they do colorblind casting in theatre, it annoys me because people aren't colorblind. You can't cast a black man and a white woman to play brother and sister without making it make sense. And hell, if you're going to cast a black man to play that part, then cast a black woman to play his sister. Make it make sense.
You coming from the space of where you're working in this speaks volumes to what I think is really important about these type of conversations. The fact that it's very easy for someone to listen into this and hear what you're saying and, you know, maybe completely agree with it, but say that this is something that they already do and they already see happening because they've read enough or they've watched enough or they hang around with enough people who have these kind of diverse views. The challenge comes, and why I think it's so important to make this clear, is that when people come from a place where they're not in contact with so many different types of diverse backgrounds and stories, they tend to and almost have to rely on media stereotypes or media images that are portrayed of people in order to form the biases that they hold. Yeah. So, you know, an example would be that still we see in films that a lot of Latin American men are portrayed with this idea of unemployment or crime, right? Because that's the shows that we watch. And this is still a thing where without what you're saying, I think there's always going to be that separation of the fact that media has this strong responsibility. And that's why your work, I think, is super important, that what you're trying to get across the point is not just through the acting, but through that back staff and through the directors and the script writers and everyone. That's the only way that this change is going to be led, that's going to have that mass impact, because media plays such a substantial role in this.
Yeah, and I think also creating an environment where people can listen to their actors. So I'm teaching one of my students. She's a uni student and she has grown up in a world kind of like this as well, and not come into contact with a lot of people from diverse spaces. She's in university now, so she's experiencing a lot more. And her sister spent a summer in London and came back and shared so much with her, and I think really enlightened her and opened her up. And she's incredibly open and inquisitive and asks questions in a way that's sensitive and kind, but also wanting to learn about, you know, how to be in a world that looks so different from the little town she grew up in. And just opening up with her and sharing my experiences and my views of mixedness, she was like, I never even thought about what that experience must be like and what that like middle ground might be like. And there's more that's being said about it and stuff like that. But again, a lot of times mixed people in shows are not exploring that. They are portraying what is also very important, which is the black fight and the black struggle. And mixed people, we are part of that. It's just a different experience of blackness, but it is an experience of blackness. But the niches to that experience aren't being kind of discussed and talked about. So I think it's about, yes, getting actors, getting directors, producers, writers behind the screen doing the work, but also, if that's not going to happen yet, then create a space where your actors feel comfortable enough to say that, why don't we talk about this? Or actually, she wouldn't say that because that's not, I could never be like, or whatever, like in that space, I could never be that soft. I can never be that gentle because that space has not created that for me. So, and I think it's just hearing that and creating space for that, because actors are intelligent. And I think there's a growing understanding of that. Actors are most of the time, very emotionally intelligent creatures. So it's trusting that and trusting their experiences as well. And I also think there is a space for having writers and actors sitting down together when you're working on, you know, long TV shows or whatever, and coming up with different storylines. I think it's definitely worth especially if you don't have people of color in your writer's room, which you should have, but get your actors in those spaces and talk to them. All actors I know are very emotionally intelligent. So yeah, if you're trusting them to play this role and to carry it, trust them to have an opinion and not just be mouthpieces for what perhaps a white writer and director have come up with in some room 2 years before it's actually being performed, you know?
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is we're only really touching on the cusp of what could come and is to come. And I think that it's very clear to see that someone like you can be such a role model for this kind of change. And, I'm sure there'll be people who listen to this, and if they haven't heard of you before, I'm sure they'll want to check out your stuff. I'll put the link in the show notes of where to check out is it showreel? Your profile?
Yeah. So, and you can find me on Instagram at Laura Lake Adebisi.
But I do think, you've been in some, your portfolio is growing, Holby City, Eastenders now. Shows that I used to love to watch growing up, but might have to dive into again. But no, really, I think what would be amazing is to be able to sit down with you again in a year or two and be able to say that, yes, the things that I spoke about, I've seen a change, and I've seen it from the outside and I've seen it from the inside in what I do. That is a dream. But, apart from that, I just have to say that it's been amazing to hear everything that you've shared, and the passion is very real. So even people who just listen to the audio version of this, even they'll get the passion, but watch the video if you want to see that real passion come out. It's been truly inspiring, and I just have to say it's been an honor.
It's been an honor too. Thank you so much for having me.
We do end the show with the classic tradition of 2 questions that are provided by a previous guest. So the 2 questions that I picked out from things that I've been written down from before. What would you tell an 11-year-old version of someone like you? So a boy or a girl that's come from somewhere where they feel that they almost have to prove their identity because they're not really accepted from more than one side.
I think quite simply, it's going to be okay. And there will be a time in your life where it won't matter. But when it does, back yourself.
I like that.
Yeah.
And secondly, how do you take care of you?
I've been trying to do a better job of it lately. I think you need to surround yourself with people that aren't anxiety inducing. You need to find peace in yourself. Find a place of peace in yourself. It doesn't have to be long. But when you find that, like when I found that place of peace, I was then able to be like very clearly measure around whom was that peace maintained, and around whom was it disturbed. And you can't always cut the people who disturb your peace out of your life. So I'm trying to get better at setting really firm boundaries around that and increasing time with myself and that place of peace, and increasing time with people who put me in that place of peace or who help maintain that space. And that's what I think is really important. And laughter. I watch a lot of TV. I always have a TV show on the go, but I'm always a little bit happier when I'm watching something that's funny. So yeah. I love Trevor Noah. I really do. I've watched all of his comedy sketches, and I know you speak about him. You've spoken about him a lot today, but he's so right. He's changing people's minds through laughter, and I guess I'm trying to change people's minds through their hearts, through getting them to feel something. And it's like I really think he's so intelligent. He's so intelligent and fantastic. And yeah.
But I know, I really think you are. And like I say, you know, drawing back to just the passion that you've given in what you say, right? It's not just this is something that I should put a bit of time to as a philanthropic idea. This is, you know, this is what you stand for. This is your core beliefs. And, you know, I just love that you're able to do something where you're able to bring across or try and inspire what your key messages are through the work that you do. So keep on doing it. And again, thank you so much for coming on today and sharing every little detail that you did. It's been amazing.
Thank you so much.